Today I'm going to read two early poems from Derek Walcott, a poet from St. Lucia in the West Indies. His poetry spans from 1948 up to his death in 2017. So I'm first going to read Missing the Sea. Something removed roars in the ears of this house, hangs its drapes windless, stuns mirrors till reflections lack substance. Some sound like the gnashing of windmills ground to a dead halt, a deafening absence, a blow. It hoops this valley, weighs this mountain, a stranger's gesture, pushes this pencil through a thick nothing now, freights cupboards with silence, folds sour laundry like the clothes of the dead, left exactly as the dead behaved by the beloved, incredulous, expecting occupancy. So often titles of the poems don't add that much, but the title here is necessary because I don't think we would understand the poem without it, and the absence of the word sea from the poem itself overlaps with the absence of the sea from the poet's own current situation in this house. And the poet builds his vision of the sea through a series of paradoxical images where absence is imagined through presence. So sight and hearing are disoriented, silence roars in the ear, and reflections lose their substance. And while it doesn't have a formal rhyme scheme or metrical scheme, the poem builds word patterns through assonance and consonance. So we have behaved by the beloved, dead halt and deafening, removed roars. And this patterning where certain vowels and consonants cluster together create a sense of accumulation, the poet heaping up words and images in order to somehow bring the sea back to life through poetic language. And so the poet pushes his pencil through a thick nothing, and then also that phrase, a thick nothing, which is itself a paradox, conveys the way that the language of the poem is itself a kind of thick presence, even when compellingly referring to absence. And much of Walcott's poetry excavates the brutal histories of slavery and colonialism in the Caribbean. And in another poem in this volume, Ruins of a Great House, he talks about the ulcerous crimes whose rot and stench remain beneath the surfaces of soil and building. And that word sour, raises questions. And for me, also about the dead, so who are the dead that he speaks of here? And that image of their clothes left exactly as they behaved is quite intriguing. So is this an act of loving memorial, or is it something more bitter? Are these dead peacefully laid to rest, or are they more haunting? And I think that the dead halt, which enacts itself in metre by the heavy stress on these two syllables, and it also it's the shortest line in the poem, so there's a sense of something kind of stopping up, something kind of obstructing, which again also brings the idea of death back into the poem. And the sea itself is fierce and threatening. It gnashes, it roars, it stuns. And again, if it weren't for the title, Missing the Sea, we might think the sea was something to be feared rather than desired. And my final question really about the poem is, who is missing the sea? So we don't have an I or an obvious narrator for the poem, and that final phrase, expecting occupancy, throws open the occupancy of the poem itself and suggests that the poet cannot birth himself into his own poetic I without the presence of the sea. And we move from 3-line stanzas to a single line at the end, which mirrors this sense of the poem opening out with that expectation at its end. And so it speaks to the significance of place in Walcott's poetry, where the poet is left both hollow with absence without the sea, yet at the same time thick with nothing from seeking to recreate it. And I want to read another of Walcott's poems about the sea. This is called The Harbour, and I think it complements Missing the Sea quite well. The fisherman rowing homeward in the dusk, do not consider the stillness through which they move. So I, since feelings drown, should no more ask for the safe twilight which your calm hands gave. And the night, urger of old lies winked at by stars that sentry the humped hills, should hear no secret faring forth. Time knows that bitter and sly sea, and love raises walls. Yet others who now watch my progress outward on a sea which is crueller than any word of love, may see in me the calm my passage makes, braving new water in an antique hoax, and the secure from thinking may climb safe to liners, hearing small rumours of paddlers drowned near stars. And I read this poem as a kind of poetic manifesto, where the idea of sailing out to sea stands in for the process of seeking out a new kind of poetry. And Walcott was one of the heralders, really, of the tradition of Caribbean poetry in English, and that image of braving new water in an antique hoax, the old and the new, portrays the adventure of melding Caribbean and English poetic forms and words. And here he uses a sonnet, a European form, to explore the contrast between safety and danger, between the bitter or fearful places he may have to voyage in his poetry. And in the first 8 lines of the sonnet, he muses over the safe twilight of simply staying in harbour, and almost persuades himself that he should not take up his secret faring forth. But the sonnet turns on the word yet in line 9, and although at risk of drowning, by voyaging forth, the poet opens up passage for others to follow more safely, and himself ends up being near the stars.